Intergenerational trauma. How does it affect Indigenous families? By Rihanna McCann. What is intergenerational trauma? Intergenerational trauma is trauma that is passed down from one generation to the next generations. Coping and adapting patterns developed in response to traumatic experiences may be learned from or otherwise impact subsequent generations living with survivors, which in turn may be handed down to future generations. What has contributed to intergenerational trauma? Residential schools had strict rules along with physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Some residential schools were also associated with Indian hospitals, which disregarded their holistic and traditional approaches along with having extremely poor conditions, sometimes even forcibly giving operations and experiments on Indigenous peoples. This has ultimately affected multiple generations from the health repercussions. In the 1960s, many people were living on reserves and struggling with poverty, high health rates, and socio-economic barriers, which led the government to get child welfare agencies to remove Indigenous children from their homes rather than provide supports and resources for their communities, more commonly known as the 60s Scoop. Examples of discrimination today that contribute to intergenerational trauma. Unfair treatment in healthcare. Many Indigenous people do not feel comfortable accessing health services due to discrimination in the past. In 2008, Brian Sinclair died in the emergency room after waiting 34 hours due to a physician's racial stereotyping. The healthcare providers assumed Brian was drunk, homeless, and poor, which led to Brian's death. Another example of discrimination is police dehumanization and violence. Between August 29th and September 9th, 2024, 6 Indigenous people were killed by police. 2 women were hit and killed by a police vehicle, and the other 4 unnamed victims were shot after calling for help or for a wellness check. Colonization and intergenerational trauma. From 1830 to 1996, Indigenous peoples were forced to attend residential schools. By the 1930s, 75% of Indigenous children had attended the schools. This resulted in the government taking away their language, tradition, foods, land, community, and so much more. Colonization and assimilation of Indigenous people has gone on for hundreds of years. An example is the Gradual Civilization Act of 1856, where Europeans aimed to assimilate their view to a more Christian and European worldview, attempting to force Indigenous people to abandon their social and cultural practices. Effects of intergenerational trauma. An Ojibwe researcher in Halifax, Amy Bombay, says that the survivors' children and grandchildren of residential schools and survivors are more prone to symptoms or at risk of anxiety, depression, substance use, thoughts of suicide, and suicide attempts. These early life traumas put residential school survivors at higher risk for health problems and social conditions such as homelessness and substance use. The loss of language is also an effect of intergenerational trauma. Approximately 237,420 Indigenous people said that they can conduct a conversation speaking their native language, which makes up 13.1% of Indigenous population. This is a 10% decrease from 1991. The growing decrease is mainly from the loss of the Indigenous people with a mother tongue, which is the first language learned at home and is still understood. 184,170 people had an Indigenous mother tongue in 2021, a decline of 14,120 from 2016.